Welcome to the family. If you enjoy powerful stories and wild adventures, subscribe now, hit like and share with someone who will love it too. The diplomatic shuttle Harmony's Edge descended through the crimson atmosphere of Vex Prime, its human crew preparing for what could be the most important first contact mission in decades. The Vexari had been hesitant to allow any aliens onto their homeworld, but recent trade negotiations had finally opened a small window of opportunity. Captain James Mitchell adjusted his universal translator as the shuttle touched down on the designated landing pad. Through the viewport, he could see the Vexari delegation waiting. Tall, graceful beings with iridescent blue skin and 4 arms, their movements fluid despite their obvious nervousness. "Remember the briefings," Mitchell told his team. "The Vexari are prey species by evolution. They're naturally skittish around anything they perceive as predatory. Keep movements slow, voices soft." Dr. Emma Rodriguez, the mission's xenobiologist, nodded while reviewing her notes. Their entire culture is built around caution and collective survival. They've never had apex predators in their evolutionary chain. Everything on this planet either runs or hides. The airlock hissed open, and the human delegation stepped onto Vex Prime soil. The gravity was lighter than Earth's, and the air carried a sweet, almost floral scent. The Vexari delegation approached with measured steps, their large compound eyes reflecting the pale sunlight. Ambassador Keth, the lead Vexari diplomat, extended 2 of his 4 arms in their traditional greeting. "Welcome, humans of Earth. We are cautiously optimistic about these proceedings." Mitchell returned the gesture carefully. "We're honored by your trust, Ambassador Keth. We hope to build a lasting friendship between our peoples." The first day of talks went smoothly. The humans were patient, accommodating and respectful of Vexari customs. They held meetings in the low-light conditions the Vexari preferred, spoke in measured tones, and avoided any sudden movements that might trigger their hosts' prey instincts. It was during the second day that everything changed. The human delegation was being given a tour of the Vexari capital city, New Refuge, when the emergency sirens began wailing. The melodic alarm sent every Vexari in sight scrambling for the nearest shelter. Buildings that looked more like reinforced bunkers than typical architecture. "What's happening?" Dr. Rodriguez asked, as Ambassador Keth's skin shifted to a deep purple. What they'd learned was a sign of extreme distress. "Shadow Stalker," Keth whispered, his voice trembling. "The apex predator has entered the city limits. All must hide until it passes. Quickly, to the shelters." But as the Vexari fled, the humans found themselves standing alone in the suddenly empty street, watching something emerge from between the towering crystalline buildings. It was massive, easily 12 feet long and 4 feet tall, moving with liquid grace on 6 powerful legs. Its hide was matte black, seeming to absorb light, and its head was an elongated wedge filled with rows of gleaming teeth. Most unsettling were its eyes, intelligent, calculating, and fixed directly on the small group of humans. The Shadow Stalker approached slowly, each step deliberate and predatory. Mitchell felt his hand drift toward his sidearm, but Dr. Rodriguez caught his wrist. "Wait," she whispered. "Look at its posture. It's not attacking, it's curious." The creature stopped about 10 feet away, tilting its massive head as it studied them. For several long moments, predator and humans regarded each other in silence. Then, to everyone's amazement, the Shadow Stalker sat back on its haunches like an enormous dog and made a sound, a deep, rumbling purr. "I'll be damned," muttered Lieutenant Tom Baker, the mission's security chief. "It's trying to communicate, Dr." Rodriguez took a careful step forward. The Shadow Stalker's purring intensified, and it lowered its head slightly. She reached into her field kit and pulled out a protein bar, standard emergency rations. "Easy there, big guy," she said softly, extending the bar. "You hungry?" The creature sniffed delicately, then opened its mouth to accept the offering. Its technique was surprisingly gentle for something with so many teeth. As it chewed, it made more soft rumbling sounds, almost like contentment. From the shelter viewports, hundreds of Vexari eyes watched in absolute terror and disbelief as the humans stood calmly beside their planet's ultimate nightmare, and the nightmare seemed to be enjoying their company. Ambassador Keth emerged from the shelter with trembling limbs, flanked by a dozen Vexari security personnel armed with sonic disruptors. The sight that greeted him defied every instinct, every piece of evolutionary wisdom coded into his species' DNA. The Shadow Stalker, the creature that had haunted Vexari nightmares for millennia, was lying on its side in the street, while Dr. Rodriguez scratched behind what could generously be called its ears. The beast's massive tail swished back and forth, creating small dust clouds, and those terrifying rumbles continued to emanate from its chest. How is this possible?" Keth whispered, his skin cycling through colors of confusion and fear. "The Shadow Stalkers have killed thousands of our people across the centuries. They are death incarnate." Captain Mitchell kept his voice calm and steady. "Ambassador, I think there might be some misunderstanding about these creatures' nature." Misunderstanding. One of the Vexari security officers stepped forward, his weapon raised. "That thing destroyed an entire farming commune just 2 cycles ago. 17 lives lost." Dr. Rodriguez looked up from where she was examining the creature's massive paws. "Did anyone actually witness the attack, or just find the aftermath?" Thus the question hung in the air as the Vexari exchanged uncertain glances. Lieutenant Baker, meanwhile, had been circling around to get a better view of the Shadow Stalker. "Doc," he called out, "you need to see this." Along the creature's flanks were dozens of old scars, some clearly from energy weapons, others from what looked like nets or restraints. Its right rear leg showed signs of an old injury that had healed improperly, giving it a slight limp. "This animal's been hunted," Dr. Rodriguez said, running her fingers over one of the scars. "Extensively. Look at these marks. Some are fresh, maybe a few weeks old." The Shadow Stalker shifted at her touch, not in aggression, but seeking more contact. It reminded Mitchell of his old retriever back on Earth, the way it would press against his leg when thunderstorms made it nervous. "With respect, Ambassador," Mitchell said carefully, "is it possible that these creatures only attack when they feel threatened, when they're cornered or defending themselves?" Keth's 4 arms gestured in the Vexari equivalent of vigorous disagreement. "They are apex predators. They hunt for sport. He was interrupted by a new sound, a different kind of rumble from deeper in the city. The Shadow Stalker's head snapped up, ears pricking forward, and it let out a series of barks that sounded almost like distress calls. "That's another one," Dr. Rodriguez said, reading the creature's body language, "and this one's agitated about something." The Shadow Stalker rose to its feet, gently nudging Rodriguez aside with its massive head. It began moving toward the sound, but slowly, looking back repeatedly at the humans as if asking them to follow. "It wants us to come with it," Baker observed, his hand resting on his weapon but not drawing it. Against all protocol and common sense, the human delegation followed the apex predator through the empty streets of New Refuge. The Vexari watched from their shelters, some following at a considerable distance, torn between terror and curiosity. They found the second Shadow Stalker 3 blocks away, trapped under a collapsed section of building that had been damaged in a recent storm. The creature was conscious but clearly in pain, making low whining sounds that their companion answered with reassuring rumbles. "It's stuck," Dr. Rodriguez said, assessing the situation. "The beam is pinning its hind leg." Without hesitation, Mitchell activated his comm. "Baker, get the cutting torch from the shuttle. Rodriguez, see if you can keep both animals calm. I'm calling for emergency medical supplies." "Sir," Baker said uncertainly, "are we really about to perform veterinary surgery on the galaxy's most feared predator?" "2 of them," Mitchell corrected. "And yes, we are." As the humans worked to free the trapped creature, more Shadow Stalkers began appearing from the shadows, not hunting but drawn by the distress calls. Soon 6 of the massive beasts surrounded the rescue operation, watching with intelligent eyes as these strange aliens helped one of their own. Ambassador Keth watched from a safe distance, his world-view crumbling with each passing moment. The cutting torch made short work of the debris, its blue flame slicing through the twisted metal beam. As soon as the trapped Shadow Stalker was free, the pack dynamic became immediately apparent to Dr. Rodriguez. The injured creature was immediately surrounded by its companions, who began a complex ritual of grooming and soft vocalizations. There, "Day family unit," she breathed, documenting everything with her scanner. "Look at the hierarchy. That large one with the silver markings on its head. That's the alpha. And see how they're all checking on the injured one. This is sophisticated social behavior." The alpha shadow stalker, easily the largest of the group at nearly 14 feet, approached the humans with careful, measured steps. Its massive head lowered until it was at eye level with Captain Mitchell, and for a long moment, predator and human stared at each other. Then the creature did something that made the watching Vexari gasp in collective disbelief. It touched its forehead gently to Mitchell's chest, a gesture that seemed unmistakably like gratitude. "Ambassador Keth," Dr. Rodriguez called out, never taking her eyes off the pack, "I need to ask you something important. When your people find evidence of shadow stalker attacks, do you ever find tracks leading away from the scene?" Keth approached cautiously, still maintaining a respectful distance from the creatures. "Tracks? Yes, always. They lead into the deep wilderness toward the Crimson Peaks. And do your people follow these tracks? Follow them?" Keth's skin shifted to a pale yellow, the color of incredulity. "Into shadow stalker territory? That would be suicide." Lieutenant Baker looked up from where he was applying a medical patch to the injured creature's leg. "What if it's not territory? What if it's a rescue route?" The humans exchanged glances, a theory forming among them. Mitchell stepped forward, addressing the alpha shadow stalker directly. "You've been trying to save people, haven't you? When disasters strike, when people get lost or injured, you find them and carry them to safety." The alpha tilted its head, making a soft sound that was almost questioning. Dr. Rodriguez pulled up her scanner's data. "Captain, these creatures have enlarged brains relative to their body size. That suggests high intelligence. Their social structure is complex. They show empathy and cooperation. What if the Vexari have been misinterpreting rescue attempts as attacks?" "That's impossible," Keth protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "The reports clearly state reports from survivors who were found far from where they went missing," Mitchell interrupted gently. "People who might have been traumatized, possibly unconscious during transport. In the dark, being carried by something this large." The implication hung in the air like morning mist. The shadow stalkers hadn't been hunting the Vexari. They'd been protecting them. Every attack had been a rescue mission, misunderstood by a prey species whose evolutionary history had programmed them to see predators as automatic threats. The injured shadow stalker tested its weight on the treated leg, then approached Lieutenant Baker. With surprising delicacy, it nuzzled his shoulder, nearly knocking him over with its size, but clearly trying to be gentle. "They're thanking us," Baker said wonderingly. "These things are actually grateful." More shadow stalkers began emerging from various hiding spots throughout the city. Apparently, they'd been drawn by the sounds of the rescue. Soon, nearly 20 of the massive creatures surrounded the small group of humans, all maintaining respectful distances, but clearly curious about these strange new beings who had helped their pack. One of the younger ones, barely the size of an earth horse, approached Dr. Rodriguez with something in its mouth. It dropped the object at her feet, a Vexari child's toy worn but carefully preserved. "Oh my God," Rodriguez whispered, picking up the small stuffed animal. "They've been collecting lost items, things that fell during rescues." Ambassador Keith stared at the toy. He recognized it as belonging to a child from the farming commune, one who had supposedly died in a shadow stalker attack 6 months ago. "But now—" "The child," he said slowly. "Little Ven from the outer settlements. We found his toy near claw marks and assumed, where are the Crimson Peaks?" Mitchell asked urgently. "North," Keth replied numbly. "About 50 kilometers, but it's wilderness, impossible terrain." "Not impossible for them," Dr. Rodriguez said, watching as the shadow stalkers began moving as a coordinated group. "They're trying to show us something." The journey to the Crimson Peaks took most of the day, with the human delegation riding in their shuttle, while the shadow stalker pack loped alongside at a steady pace that spoke of endurance evolved over millennia. Ambassador Keth had insisted on joining them, though his nervous system was clearly pushed to its limits by traveling in such close proximity to the creatures his people had feared for generations. "Their movement pattern is interesting," Dr. Rodriguez observed, watching from the shuttle's viewport. "They're not running in a typical predator formation. They're protecting our flanks, making sure we don't get separated from the group." The Alpha Shadow Stalker, whom Lieutenant Baker had started calling Silver due to its distinctive markings, occasionally looked up at the shuttle with what could only be described as concern, as if checking to make sure the strange flying humans were still keeping up. As they crested a ridge overlooking the Crimson Peaks, Ambassador Keth made a sound of pure astonishment. In the valley below, nestled against the red stone cliffs, was a settlement unlike anything in Vexari architectural records. The buildings were simple but sturdy, clearly constructed to blend with the natural rock formations. Gardens flourished in the protected valley, and the sound of running water suggested a natural spring. But most shocking of all were the figures moving about the settlement, Vexari. Dozens of them, living peacefully in the shadow of the peaks. "That's impossible," Keth whispered. "The official records show this area as completely uninhabitable, stalked by predators." The shuttle landed in a clearing near the settlement, and immediately the human delegation found themselves surrounded by curious Vexari, who showed none of the fearful behavior they'd encountered in the city. These people moved with confidence, their skin showing colors of excitement and welcome rather than fear. An elderly Vexari approached, his movements aided by a walking stick carved from local stone. What made Captain Mitchell do a double-take was the Shadow Stalker walking calmly beside him, not as a threat, but clearly as a companion. "Visitors," the elder called out in accented standard. "It has been many seasons since we've seen anyone. From the cities, I am Elder Thane, and this is my friend Echo." He gestured to the Shadow Stalker, who sat politely beside him like a well-trained dog. Ambassador Keth stumbled out of the shuttle, his skin cycling through so many colors it was almost strobing. "Elder Thane, but you're dead. The records show you died in a Shadow Stalker attack 15 years ago." Thane chuckled, a sound like wind chimes. "Dead? Hardly, though I suppose that's what the city folk would assume." He gestured around the thriving settlement. "When the great storm destroyed my original home, Echo here found me in the rubble. I was badly injured, unconscious for days. When I woke, I was here, being cared for by these magnificent creatures." Dr. Rodriguez stepped forward, her scientific mind racing. "You've been living with them? All of you?" "Living with them, learning from them," confirmed a younger Vexari woman who approached with a small child riding on the back of a juvenile Shadow Stalker. "They're not predators. They're guardians. They've been protecting our people for generations, but fear and misunderstanding kept us from seeing the truth." The child on the Shadow Stalker's back giggled and waved at the visitors. "Uncle Silver brought new friends," he announced, pointing at the Alpha who had guided them here. Keth's legs gave out and he sat heavily on a nearby rock. "All this time, all the hunting parties, the weapons development, the fear, and they were trying to help us." Elder Thane nodded sadly. "The Shadow Stalkers have tried many times to bring lost or injured Vexari here to safety. But when rescue parties from the cities arrive, they see only monsters with blood on their claws, the blood of those they've carried to medical help. In their fear, your people attack, and the Shadow Stalkers are forced to defend themselves." Lieutenant Baker looked around at the peaceful settlement, watching Vexari children play with Shadow Stalker cubs while adults worked together in the gardens. "How many people live here?" "Nearly 300, Thane replied, "all supposedly killed by the very creatures who saved their lives. We've been trying to send messages to the cities for years, but anyone who ventures close to our valley is assumed to be dead when they don't return immediately." The irony was staggering. The Vexari had been fighting a war against their own protectors, fueled by misunderstanding and ancestral fears. That evening, around a communal fire in the heart of the hidden settlement, the true scope of the tragedy began to unfold. Elder Thane shared stories passed down through the valley community, tales of Shadow Stalkers arriving in the aftermath of natural disasters, their powerful senses able to detect survivors trapped in rubble or lost in the wilderness. The great earthquake of 30 years ago, Thane recounted, his weathered hands gesturing expressively. The city records show nearly 200 dead or missing, but here we know the truth. Shadow Stalker packs worked for weeks pulling survivors from collapsed buildings, carrying them to safety in caves and sheltered valleys. Dr. Rodriguez documented everything, her scanner working overtime to record testimonies and behavioral observations. A small shadow stalker had curled up next to her, apparently fascinated by the soft beeping of her equipment. The communication barrier has been the real tragedy, she noted. The shadow stalkers developed rescue behaviors, but they couldn't explain their intentions to a species that fled on sight. Captain Mitchell studied the settlement's layout with a tactical eye. Everything was positioned for maximum protection from the elements, with clear sight lines and multiple escape routes. This isn't random, he observed. This entire valley is strategically designed as a refuge. The shadow stalkers guided us in the construction, admitted a middle-aged Vexari named Keller, who served as the settlement's primary architect. They showed us which areas were safe from avalanches, where to dig for water, how to position the buildings for optimal protection. They've been planning this sanctuary for decades. Ambassador Keth had been largely silent throughout the evening, his worldview undergoing complete reconstruction. Finally, he spoke. "We've been preparing for war," he said quietly. "The Council approved a new weapons program just last month. Sonic charges designed specifically to target Shadow Stalker hearing ranges. We were going to—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. The implications were horrific. The Vexari had been on the verge of committing genocide against their own protectors. "There's something else," Elder Thane said, his expression growing troubled. "The Shadow Stalkers have been agitated lately. More frequent rescue attempts, longer-ranging patrols. We think they sensed something coming." As if summoned by his words, the Alpha Shadow Stalker, Silver, approached the fire circle. The massive creature moved with obvious urgency, making a series of low barks and whines, while looking repeatedly toward the northern peaks. Dr. Rodriguez stood, following Silver's gaze. "What is it, big guy? What's out there?" The creature padded to the edge of the firelight and sat, continuing its calls. Soon, answering calls echoed from multiple points around the valley. Other shadow stalkers, all focused on the same northern direction. "They're communicating across the territory," Lieutenant Baker observed. "This is coordinated behavior on a massive scale." Elder Thane rose with some difficulty, his expression grave. "When they behave like this, it means danger approaches. Natural disaster, usually. The last time was just before the great storm that destroyed 3 settlements 5 years ago." Captain Mitchell activated his comm unit. "This is Captain Mitchell. To Harmony's Edge. I need you to run a full geological and meteorological scan of the Crimson Peaks region. Priority urgent." The response came back within minutes, and the news was devastating. "Captain, we're detecting massive seismic instability throughout the entire northern mountain range. The geological indicators suggest a catastrophic landslide event is imminent, possibly within the next 24 to 48 hours. "How catastrophic?" Mitchell asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Sir, based on the readings, we're looking at a debris flow that could bury everything within a 50-kilometer radius. The valley where you're located, the capital city of New Refuge, everything in the projected path would be completely destroyed." The circle around the fire fell silent as the translation reached the Vexari. This was what the Shadow Stalkers had been sensing, an approaching disaster that would dwarf any previous natural catastrophe in Vexari history. "How many people are in the danger zone?" Dr. Rodriguez asked quietly. Ambassador Keth's skin had gone completely white. "The capital alone has over 500,000 residents. The surrounding settlements, we're looking at nearly 1 million lives," Mombilla approached Ambassador Keth directly. The massive creature lowering its head until it was inches from the terrified diplomat. For a long moment, they remained motionless. Then, Silver made a sound unlike any they'd heard before. A deep, resonant call that was somehow both mournful and determined. "He's asking for help," Elder Thane translated. "The Shadow Stalkers can't save everyone alone." Dawn broke over the Crimson Peaks with an ominous rumble that seemed to emanate from the mountains themselves. The Shadow Stalker pack had barely slept, their restless energy spreading throughout the valley settlement as they prepared for what Elder Thane called the Great Running. their term for massive, coordinated rescues. Captain Mitchell stood in the shuttle's communications bay, coordinating what would either be the greatest humanitarian effort in Vexari history or its most tragic failure. "Admiral," he said into the comm, "I need every available ship from the fleet, and I need them now." "Captain, the Vexari government is calling this an act of war," Admiral Hayes replied through the static. "They claim you've been compromised by some kind of alien influence. The Galactic Council is demanding explanations." "Let them demand," Mitchell said grimly. "In 18 hours, 1 million people are going to die unless we act. The Shadow Stalkers are offering to help coordinate the evacuation, but we need transport capacity. You're asking me to trust the tactical planning of creatures that the Vexari consider monsters." Dr. Rodriguez took the comm. "Admiral, these creatures have been running disaster relief operations for centuries. They know this terrain better than any satellite scan, and they can detect geological instabilities that our equipment might miss. They're not monsters. They're the most sophisticated rescue organization this planet has ever seen." Meanwhile, Ambassador Keth had been in frantic communication with the Vexari Council, trying to convince them that evacuation was necessary. The response had been predictably resistant. "They don't believe the threat is real," he reported to the humans. "And they certainly don't trust information coming from Shadow Stalkers. The Defense Minister is convinced this is some kind of elaborate trap." Silver, the Alpha Shadow Stalker, approached the group with obvious frustration. The massive creature had been trying to communicate evacuation routes, using claw marks in the dirt to draw what looked like topographical maps. Dr. Rodriguez had been documenting his efforts, amazed by the level of detail and strategic thinking involved. "Look at this," she said, projecting the images onto her portable display. "He's showing us 17 different evacuation routes out of the danger zone. He's accounting for population density, terrain difficulty, and what I think are seasonal weather patterns. This is military-grade tactical planning." The breakthrough came when Lieutenant Baker had an idea that was either brilliant or completely insane. "What if we don't ask permission?" he suggested. "What if we just start the evacuation and let the politicians catch up later?" "That would be a direct violation of," Keth began. "Ambassador," Mitchell interrupted, "in 16 hours there won't be anyone left to prosecute us. Sometimes you have to choose between following orders and saving lives." The Shadow Stalker pack had apparently reached the same conclusion. Without waiting for official approval, they began implementing their rescue protocol. Groups of 3 or 4 Shadow Stalkers started leaving the valley, heading toward different settlements in the danger zone. Elder Thane watched them go with obvious pride. "They're going to start bringing people back whether those people want to come or not," he explained. "When disaster threatens, Shadow Stalkers don't ask permission to save lives." The first evacuees arrived within hours. A family from a remote farming outpost, carried on the backs of Shadow Stalkers and clearly traumatized by the experience. The parents were nearly catatonic with fear, but their young children seemed more curious than afraid. "They came out of nowhere," the father gasped to Ambassador Keith. "The big one just grabbed our daughter and put her on its back. We thought they were going to eat her." "But they didn't hurt you," Dr. Rodriguez pointed out gently. "They brought you to safety." More groups arrived throughout the day. Confused, frightened Vexari, who had been unceremoniously rescued from their homes by creatures they'd been taught to fear. The valley settlement worked tirelessly to provide shelter, food and comfort to the growing refugee population. By evening, nearly 3,000 Vexari had been brought to safety, but it was a fraction of those still in danger. The Shadow Stalkers were working beyond exhaustion, making multiple trips to increasingly distant settlements. "They can't keep this pace," Dr. Rodriguez observed, watching Silver limp back into the valley with another group of evacuees. "They're wearing themselves out." As if responding to her concern, the mountain itself provided an answer. A massive tremor shook the entire region, and for several terrifying seconds, everyone thought the catastrophe had begun early. But when the shaking stopped, something had changed. From caves and crevices throughout the mountain range, more shadow. Stalkers began emerging, hundreds of them responding to some kind of pack-wide summons. The final hours before the predicted landslide transformed into a coordination effort that would have impressed any military strategist. Nearly 400 shadow stalkers had answered the call, emerging from hidden lairs throughout the mountain range to participate in the largest rescue operation in their species' history. Dr. Rodriguez found herself in the unprecedented position of serving as a translator between species, using body language, sonic patterns, and crude drawings to help coordinate between the shadow stalker rescue teams and the growing human fleet that had finally arrived in Vex Prime's orbit. Shuttle Group 7, you've got a pack of 6 shadow stalkers converging on the industrial district, she radioed to the evacuation pilots. They're marking safe landing zones with reflective stones. Look for the silver glints. What had started as a desperate improvisation had evolved into a seamless joint operation. The shadow stalkers' knowledge of terrain and their ability to detect unstable ground allowed them to guide shuttles to safe landing zones, while their natural authority over the landscape helped organize panicked Vexari civilians into orderly evacuation groups. Ambassador Keth had undergone perhaps the most dramatic transformation of anyone. The diplomat who had started the week, terrified of shadow stalkers, was now riding on Silver's back, using the Alpha's elevated position to coordinate between different evacuation sites via comm unit. Never in my wildest dreams, he called down to Captain Mitchell, did I imagine I'd be conducting diplomacy from the back of our planet's apex predator. The real breakthrough had come when the evacuated Vexari began to understand what was happening. Fear gave way to amazement as they watched their supposed monsters working tirelessly to save lives. Children who had been taught shadow stalker bedtime stories as cautionary tales found themselves being gently carried to safety by the very creatures they'd been taught to fear. One little Vexari girl, no more than 6 years old, had even started braiding flowers into her rescuer's mane, a gesture that reduced Elder Thane to tears when he saw it. 70,000 evacuated and counting, Lieutenant Baker reported from his position coordinating shuttle traffic. The shadow stalkers have been bringing people to safety faster than our ships can transport them off-planet. But time was running out. The seismic readings were becoming increasingly erratic, and several minor rockfalls had already begun in the upper peaks. The mountain was preparing to reshape itself, and anyone still in the danger zone would be caught in an avalanche of stone and earth traveling at speeds that would flatten everything in its path. Final warning, all evacuation teams, Mitchell broadcast on all frequencies, we have less than 2 hours before the projected catastrophe. Begin final sweep and withdrawal. Silver approached the human captain. The massive shadow stalker's breathing labored from days of constant rescue work. The creature's intelligent eyes met Mitchell's, and somehow, without words, they shared an understanding. There were still people out there, isolated settlements, individuals who hadn't received the evacuation warnings, those who had refused to leave their homes. One more run, Mitchell said, knowing what Silver was asking. But then you get out of there too. Your people need you alive. The final evacuation wave was a race against time itself. Shadow stalkers sprinted through increasingly unstable terrain, while human shuttles made dangerous low-altitude runs to extract the last survivors. Every minute brought new signs of the impending disaster: rockfalls, sudden fissures in the ground, and an ominous silence from the mountain's wildlife as every sensible creature fled to safety. When the landslide finally came, it was visible. From orbit, a massive section of the northern mountain range simply collapsed, creating an avalanche that moved like a grey tidal wave across the landscape. The destruction was total. Everything in the debris field was buried under hundreds of feet of rock and earth. But the death toll was zero. In the aftermath, as rescue teams surveyed the devastation, the true scope of what had been accomplished became clear. Nearly 1 million Vexari had been evacuated from the disaster zone, saved through the combined efforts of human technology and shadow stalker knowledge. The political ramifications would take years to sort out, but the immediate result was undeniable. 2 species that had misunderstood each other for centuries had come together in crisis and accomplished the impossible. Ambassador Keth stood beside Silver on a ridge overlooking the devastation, both of them exhausted but alive. The diplomatic mission had been a success beyond anyone's wildest imagination, though not at all in the way they had planned. "My people will never see you the same way again," Keth told his unlikely companion. And perhaps that's exactly what we needed. In the distance, human ships worked alongside Shadow Stalker packs to establish temporary shelters for the evacuees. It was, Dr. Rodriguez noted in her final report, the beginning of a beautiful friendship. End of story.